Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks so much. I'm really delighted to be here. I speak to a lot of different kinds of folks all over this very interesting and diverse district, and I'm always very, very happy to be talking to different kinds of people, including people very different from myself, coming from a different background. I also say every once in a while I get to talk to my peeps, and I'm really glad that today's one of those days I get to talk to folks with some of the same concerns and some of the same kind of driving background. Let me say too, if you all want, I feel like this is a metaphor for the country. We have a small elite at the top, and we've got a shrinking middle class, and everybody else is kind of going towards the bottom. So please don't hesitate to come in and fill in there, or maybe folks will come from outside. So as Mick said, I am Anthony Flaccavento. I am a farmer from just outside of Abingdon. I'm sure most of you all know where Abingdon is, and have been in the district since 1985. I was in eastern Kentucky and central Kentucky for about 8 years before that. So kind of been in the neighborhood for over 3 decades. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and why I'm running for Congress, but I'm also going to talk here about, please come in, I'm going to talk here about some things as they relate to, I think, the topics your keynote speaker covered. I want to begin with a paraphrasing of a Wendell Berry quote. How many people here know who Wendell Berry is? I'd say a goodly number of you do. I had the unbelievable privilege of visiting Wendell on his farm about 15 years ago. I just sent him a note and he said, come on out some Sunday afternoon, and I did, and I got to spend several hours with him and his wife Tanya, which was really wonderful, and we've kind of stayed in touch since then. But I don't have the exact words here, but in a essay from his book called Sex, Economy, Freedom, and Community, a wonderful series of essays done in the late 90s, he said essentially, no matter how destructive are the practices of the corporations or the policy of government, the root of our problems is always to be found in private life, in how we live. And so from reading a little bit about the theme of this conference, it brought to mind that quote of Wendell's that I've used a number of times, because let's be honest, the corporations, and in some cases the government, what they do and don't do are absolutely part of the problem. But as Wendell says further on in that same essay, the world is being destroyed by the greed of the rich and powerful, no doubt about it, but there's not enough rich and powerful people to destroy it. For that, they need the complacency of ordinary people. And so what he's really saying is not that we don't pay attention to government policy, certainly not that we don't try to move corporations in a much better and healthier direction for people and the environment, but that ultimately it is about us and how we live. And so I'm really delighted to see, both in the vendors and the kinds of folks here, that this is a group of people who are trying to live well in your own places. And that's what we have to do. And I'm a believer that as more and more of us do that, live well in our own places, and build the communities and the businesses and the farms and the markets around that idea of living well in our own places, we gradually become kind of an immovable force for a better world, a healthier world, a more prosperous world. We're making it happen from the bottom up. We need it also to happen at the top, but let's do what we can from the bottom up. So I've been farming as a market farmer since, well, it's about 18 years of that. The farm we're on now is an old tobacco farm, and as Mick said, when we got it, it was kind of burned out. First year we had an organic inspector come out. They could not find an earthworm, no matter how many places they dug. The test results from Virginia Tech said we had 1.9% organic matter, and those of you who follow such things, you know that means in our part of the world that when it's hot, the clay is like a rock, and when it's wet, it's mud. Over the 12 years we've been on that piece of land, we have gradually rejuvenated it. We have about 5.5% organic matter now on most of the farm, and a pretty productive little organic farm. And I say that, not to get too much into the agricultural details, but just to say that even when we've messed up for a period of time, personally or as a society or in our our policies and practices, we can revitalize and rejuvenate if we take the right model. We really can. We can do it in our soils, and we can do it in our communities and in our politics. We really can. And seeing that happen on my own farm, seeing sort of dried up, biologically dead soil become very vibrant, very productive soil in a matter of just a little over a decade kind of gives me hope for the larger world. In addition to my work as a farmer and whatnot, I started an organization called Appalachian Sustainable Development. Some of you are familiar with that. And ASD's purpose, when we formed ASD, there was the concept of sustainable development was pretty new, at least as a name. And we set about not to do what most people who were jumping into the sustainable development field were doing, which was to develop complex sorts of evaluation tools and sustainability matrices and all this kind of intellectual stuff. We just basically said, well, let's see if we can make our part of the world more sustainable, the economy. So we jumped in. We were a hands-on organization, an experimental organization, started enterprises, helped many, many private businesses, farmers, food products businesses, loggers, wood products businesses, small businesses. That was our emphasis. Let's see if we can do it here in Central Appalachia. We went about it. And we were so much an action-oriented organization that I remember being interviewed by the Bristol Herald-Courier just a couple years after we started ASD. And I don't think I said exactly this, but the quote in the paper was, "We don't think, we act." And I thought, I think what I said is, we don't just think, we act. But anyway, I thought, well, okay, if I had to choose one or the other, I'd rather act than think. So that's what we did. Along the way, we also worked to do a number of things. I was part of a small group that successfully kept a Walmart out of Abingdon and instead started a process of small business revitalization, of downtown revitalization, a process that we see now in communities all over the Ninth, from Haysai in the coal fields to Galax, to even many, many smaller towns, certainly Floyd. We're seeing this focus on building a bottom-up economy, and we're seeing this tremendous emphasis on building on what we have. We started that in Abingdon back in the mid-90s, and we felt that keeping another big box, when we already had plenty surrounding us, out of the community was important to being able to put the focus on small independent businesses and what they brought to the community. Along the way, I'd say I've learned a few things, and I'm going to mention about 4 or 5 of these things. And each one of these things that I've kind of learned in the process of trying to do this work of sustainable development over nearly 30 years is in essence also one of the core reasons why I'm running for Congress, and one of the things that I believe I would take to Washington if you all and many, many others sent me there. First of all, what we're doing as a society as a whole, economically and politically, isn't working. If what you believe is that we should have widely shared prosperity for people now, and the possibility of prosperity for our kids and grandkids and their grandkids, what we're doing with trickle-down economics, what we're doing with so-called free trade that isn't really free, what we're doing with that economic model just isn't working, and it's time to start a new way of thinking about our economy. You know, when you think about the extraordinary concentration of wealth, and it's been measured and documented in so many different ways, we know that we're at a place now where we have fewer people owning a larger share of wealth than at any time in our history, save right at the advent of the Great Depression. We know it when we look at the concentration of ownership in the media, in our food system with 4 companies controlling 80% of meats that make it to consumers. Seed companies, Monsanto and a handful of others controlling so much of that. So we see this concentration bearing up in every way, and it's really not good for us, and it's so kind of anti-American, where one of our core values is that Jeffersonian idea of everybody owning a piece of the pie. And we're not. We're losing that piece of the pie. So this trickle-down model hasn't worked. What we've substituted for it, or what it actually is, we didn't substitute. What it actually is it's a suck-up model. It's a suck-up economy. We suck up wealth. We suck up wealth from homeowners to Wall Street banks. We suck up wealth from small farms and small businesses to a tiny class of Wall Street banks and international corporations. And the problem is that if given all that away to this small group at the top really led to a trickle down of prosperity, it'd be one thing, but it hasn't. It simply has not. So it's time to change that, and the exciting thing is that we can. We can. We really can. So my second learning in this, kind of this 25, 28-year period of experimentation, is that another model, another economic model is possible, and that it's emerging. It's emerging in many parts of our district, not nearly enough places, not fast enough, not big enough. But this bottom-up economy model, some people call it an asset-based economic model, where you focus on what's good, what's unique, what's strong, along with what's missing from your community. But what I broadly call a sustainable development model, it is making a difference. It is creating revitalized downtowns. It's creating the strongest, best, healthiest local food systems that we have had in our area in at least the last 50 years. Again, not nearly enough, but we're seeing it in all of the farmers markets that have emerged, and not just in the farmers markets, but in local groceries, restaurants, cooperative buying models that are reaching not just the foodie elite, but ordinary people, working people. We see it in the emphasis on SNAP benefits at farmers markets, and now we can reach the full spectrum of the community, eating a little bit better, supporting farmers in the process. We see it beyond just the farm and food economy. We see it in small businesses generally. We see it in forest products. We see it in the emergence of the Crooked Road, Round the Mountain, Heartwood, and all that has said, you know what, we have this rich and vibrant culture and history and music and artisans. Let's not monetize it in the way we usually do, is let's take a whole bunch, let's produce the heck out of them as cheaply as possible. Once we build a market, let's offshore it and let's be making Appalachian bowls in China. No, rather we've said, let's invest in those musicians, those artisans, those craftspersons, those local food producers, and the places where they can share their goods. Let's invest there and bring folks both within and outside the region to make that part of the new economy. And it's, again, not enough, but it's happening all over the district. Part of this then is my third idea, that really when we talk about, we all know that money's tight. It's tight in the pocketbooks of us individually. It's tight for us as a nation. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one thing that we're also learning is that this economic model, this bottom-up economic model, also lends itself to the idea of community capital. That we don't have to, as we've been doing for the last 40 years or so, we don't have to equip every single farm and every single entrepreneur and every single household with the equipment and the technologies and the cash that they need to individually pursue prosperity. Instead, we can sometimes invest in pieces of capital that make the whole community a little better off, that link the buyers and the sellers, that help people add value to their products. And I'm talking about things like farmers markets, these venues, the destinations, again, on the Crooked Road, these sort of artisan destinations. Certainly you think Floyd Country Store is one example of that. I'm talking about value-added commercial kitchens. I'm talking about the Appalachian Harvest packing facility that we built in Duffield, Virginia, that allows right now about 60 farmers, but could do 100 or more farmers, small farmers, limited resource farmers, to gain access to large, well-paying markets. A tiny investment when you think of it per farmer, per ton of produce and eggs moving to the markets. It's a way to save money at the same time, bring us together where we create this community capital. It's happening in so many ways. It's a great bang for the buck. It makes sense as public policy that we invest in these things, and we should be doing it to create this shared prosperity. Also, a fourth lesson here is that when we do this, when we begin to create these pieces of community capital, and we link that with training the entrepreneurs, the farmers, the loggers, and the markets, that those are kind of the three key ingredients, new ways of producing or doing things combined with access to markets and the capital you need to get to those markets, we start to see a real economic engine taking place. And we start to see some profound things happening. When I started fooling around with this back in the late 80s, early 90s, our first effort at a cooperative farming venture was me, a couple of old hippies, and 3 Amish guys. Growing produce, a few other things, selling them to high-end restaurants. We were selling them to restaurants that none of us could afford to go to except through the kitchen door. And we did that for a few years, and it was an important step in what we did. But after several years of doing that, we realized that we were not reaching the average salt-of-the-earth, born and raised Appalachian farmer, most of whom were still doing tobacco at that point, along with maybe beef cattle. And so we started thinking, what would it take? And this is when we started Appalachian Harvest and started looking at bigger markets for more ordinary products. Because at some point in that process, I realized that although we loved these chefs, and although we liked what we were doing, we were not going to transform our food system or our economy with kohlrabi and arugula. We were going to have to figure out a way that cucumbers and peppers and tomatoes and sweet corn, that eggs and chicken and beef and pork and that kind of normal things that ordinary people produced and ordinary people ate on a regular basis would be what we would have to do, rather than this kind of niche orientation that we had. So we did that. And that's how we brought in. And what we found farmers who historically had no involvement with organic farming and really a negative view of it, came around pretty quickly when they saw the market opportunities in that. With the help of a really strong training program that included cooperative extension and the land grants but was locally rooted, and this infrastructure, we kind of shifted, I call it, we shifted our base of farmers from the ponytail crowd to the Ollie North crowd. And that's kind of a profound shift that we made. Some of you are old enough to know who Ollie North was. It really something. And these guys grabbed a hold of it, and they're now sort of the backbone of this Appalachian Harvest system. So here's what that says to me. That's just one little example. We did a similar thing with loggers who were primarily doing high grading and clear cutting. They did high grading and clear cutting because the value of every log, every tree they cut down was so low. We said the real problem is not just what these guys do. The problem is that they don't get much for everything they do. So we created a similar sort of system that started in the forest, went to the marketplace, in this case people's homes and schools and buildings, and built a kind of value-added integrated wood product system based on sustainable forest management, paid the loggers much more, created this chain of custody of these wood products. These are both examples of the kind of transition we need. It's an example of how, if we create the right market incentives, if we use government investment in a smart way and building on that kind of community capital that adds value, we begin to get way beyond the choir that we always are complaining about, that it's always just this small group of us who think alike and talk alike and dress alike. You start to get very different people involved in it, and you build a much more broad and authentic base of people when you create those kinds of systems. They're the exception to the rule still, but they're springing up all around the country. What I would like to do in Congress is make the investment available, make the policy appropriate so that that kind of thing grows exponentially and dramatically and really becomes the backbone of our economy all around the country. Not just in the food system, not just in forest products, not just in artisan and craft and the cultural end of the economy, but in manufacturing. So that companies like Acme Panel in Radford that's building these super insulated, structurally insulated panels and selling them become companies that grow and flourish, and companies like a new one in Abingdon that's got an energy efficient process for bringing down the use of oil and making the burning of oil when you have to do it in boilers much more efficient. That should be the norm, but to do that isn't just a matter of a mandate from on top, it's a matter of working with our local communities to build that from the bottom up. Ultimately, and I'll wind up here so we can open it up to questions and discussion. Ultimately, this is really, as Wendell said, it's really a matter of how we live our lives personally, but we have to extend that trying to live well in our places that I mentioned to the public sphere, to our role as citizens. And right now, that's a tough sell, because right now, the vast majority of people in our country are worn out on politics. They're cynical about people like me that are running. I can't tell you how many people have said to me, I like what I hear from you. It sounds good to me, but will you change when you go to Washington? And you know what? Unless we fundamentally change our political process and take big money out of politics, I probably will. That's the truth of it. I probably will, at least to some degree, no matter how committed I am, because right now, to get into public office, and even more to stay in public office, it's all about the money. And the only way to get enough money is to make allegiances with the few people that got most of it and the lobbyists that represent their interests. And that's fundamentally what's wrong with our political system. We've got to change that. We've got to change that. So beyond all the economic policy, beyond all the kind of really exciting and wonderful emerging opportunities that we have in the food system, in the economy overall, in this district and outside, fundamentally we have to tackle money. And secondly, and by the way, there's some very interesting and far-reaching ways that people are talking about doing that. The second thing we have to do, for those of us who've been working on sustainability, those of us who've been working on a healthier food system, those of us working on this kind of bottom-up economy, whatever our political, whether we're a D, an R, an I, or a libertarian, whatever we are, the folks of us in this room working on these kinds of things, the other thing we have to do is we have to reclaim morality and values as heart and soul of our work too, and say that those other folks that talk all the time about values and morality, they're not the only ones working, driven by ethics, driven by morals, driven by values, driven by a fundamental concern for the well-being of our family and our nation. We have that as our highest priority too. We've got to stop shrinking from that and say we are a people of morals and values as well. So I think we've got 5 to 10 minutes maybe of questions and discussion. So please, I would love to have conversation. Yes, sir.
I have one question, sir. The current administration is proposing drastic defense cuts to probably take place at the beginning of next year. What would be your position on that?
Well, we have a pretty volatile world. We see that every day in the news, and the terrible tragedy of our ambassador being killed in Libya, a guy who was very clearly for the Libyan people. And what that means is that in the short to medium term, we have to maintain a strong defense. At the same time, I'm one who believes that there is room in the defense budget, and so do a lot of generals, a lot of Joint Chiefs of Staff, to make, again, smart decisions about the weapon systems, about the bases that are no longer necessary to this defense, and that if we focus our energy on, very much like what we need to do in our other policy, but if we focus on where do we really get the value we need, and the value is what do we need to do in terms of personnel, weapon systems, and other things to maintain a strong defense, I believe absolutely we can do that and still make significant cuts to defense. But it's going to have to be a process that is phased in, because when we do start closing bases, domestically and overseas, just like in other industries, that affects people and their livelihoods and their ability to care for their families. So all of that should be on the table, but it should be a transitional process, and we should be working very hard to make sure that folks that are impacted by that have alternatives. Yes, sir.
What policies would you support or try to develop and implement that would help consumers in Southwest Virginia to deal with rising energy rates?
So that, again, is kind of a short-term, long-term question. The long-term solution is greatly increasing the efficiency of our homes, our buildings, our transportation fleet. It also involves things that are happening like in downtown Bristol, as well as Floyd and other places, of sort of bringing where we work and where we live closer together, making communities, if not walkable, at least a much shorter transit from shopping, working, and living. There's profound things we can do so that even with higher gas and energy prices, if we're using 50% of the energy, obviously people can bear higher prices. So that's kind of the long term that we need to, and that means public policy that encourages and invests in that efficiency, that kind of community proximity, and of course, new technologies. In the short run, I think it's a question, there's not a whole lot that we can do about gas prices, I don't believe. There are some things, but there's not a great deal that we can do. They ebb and flow so much. But what we can do is improve people's incomes by investing in them and in better jobs for them. One of the real issues, one of the reasons why high gas prices are biting so much right now is because so many people are underemployed and unemployed. And to the degree that people have better jobs that pay better wages and provide benefits, or that the public provides benefits when they're out, again, that doesn't take away the energy price issue, but it makes it less of a pinch, less of a direct hit on somebody if you have a decent paying job that gives you medical benefits. So I think that's where we put our efforts in the short run. Yes?
My only criticism, Anthony, is that you're not running in the 6th District. We need somebody like you up there.
Right on.
Well, thank you. Really, the thing is, obviously, when I go to Congress, it can't just be one person singing this tune. So I'm calling friends and colleagues all over the country who know me from sustainable development work, ag work, whatever, and they're choosing to invest in my campaign because they have the idea that while I'm obviously focused on the 9th, first and foremost, I would be making, they hope, better decisions for the country as a whole. Well, you all keep your eyes and ears open for other people in other parts of the country too. First give your money to me, then give me more money. But after that, look for those other progressive voices, those working people that are trying to get into Congress and the Senate around the country, and invest in them as well, because it's going to take more than a handful of people to change the dynamic there.
Maybe you can convince Joel Salatin to run next time.
Yeah, well, wouldn't that be something? Joel would be, he would take no prisoners in Congress. It would be great to see him clear the place out. It'd be great. Anybody else? Well, again, okay, one more question and then we'll stop.
What do you do about the super PACs that were recently approved by the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so the court, in most ways, is making bad decisions, I think. One of the essence of the Citizens United decision, which built on a lot of decisions leading up to it that was sort of giving more and more free speech right to corporations, and a whole history of law that has made corporations more like people over time. That it wasn't so much a sea change as a building on earlier decisions, but part of it is they said that corporations have the right to speech because corporations are associations of people. And that really is fundamentally false. An association of people is like the folks running the farmers market. It's like the Kiwanis or the Ruritan. It's the PTA. Those are associations, and associations by definition have kind of shared responsibility and for decision making. And that's not the way it works for a corporation. If you're, whatever you are, IBM, Monsanto, a company with progressive politics or not, the reality is they do not consult the tens of thousands of workers before they decide where the money goes in the PAC. It does not function at all like an association of people. And yet, Citizens United granted free speech as if that's what they were, an association of 10,000 or 50,000 or 1 million people. Not at all. It's a fundamentally, logically flawed decision. But with this Supreme Court, it's not going to change. That's clearly, with the recent decision about Montana's corporate funding law, they're not going to change it. So what we need to do is pursue a constitutional amendment for that. There's a groundswell of interest to turn that over. While we're working on that, we need to put other legislation in place like the Fair Elections Now Act. I don't have time to talk about it, but Google Fair Elections Now Act and you will find a very interesting and serious piece of legislation that came up in 2011 to address the problem of big money in politics. Okay, I think this means it's time to stop. Sorry.